if this will let me change pages. So as I just said, the recording is going, or the meeting will be recorded. Just want that in there. And then always ask if you're not speaking or aren't responding to anything, please keep yourself muted. It just helps not to have any interruptions there. Questions, comments, put them in chat. Philip or myself will monitor that and try and bring those up at the best possible time. Otherwise, raise your hand. It's a lot easier for us to see those come up than messages sometimes when presenting. Throughout the session, depending on participation, we do give away a $25 gift card at the end. So ask questions, give comments, feedback during the session on anything, and you get added to the randomization wheel. At the end of the event, we have our grand prize giveaway, and that'll be based on going through our survey, which is in this next slide after our sponsors. And then our survey, just mn365.org/survey. And we have that posted throughout our meetings today. So as you're going through attending sessions, go ahead and fill those out. And with that, Philip, I can hand that over to you.
Thank you, Doug, for handing over. And welcome to my session. I hope everyone's having a great day so far. For me, it's almost the end of the day. It's 5:30 here in Austria. That's where I'm streaming from today. My session's going to be about conditional access. And we are not going to talk about every single technical possibility there is. So if you're looking for that in a session, you're probably in the wrong one. We are talking about best practices. That's what I understand as more than just showing possibilities. So the idea would be to share our best practices with you, our approach that we use as a basis for discussion with our customers, or that we even used internally. Before we get into the agenda, let me introduce myself really quick. My name's Philippe Ebner. I'm a Microsoft 365 consultant based in Austria. I actually also added a map of Europe right there. It's the small country between Germany and Italy. I've heard Doug already visited Austria. That's quite interesting and a funny coincidence. Back to the introduction, I've been working with the Microsoft 365 since the official launch of Microsoft Teams. So it's been quite a few years already, and I'm especially focusing on identity and access management, on governance and compliance topics in Microsoft, using the Microsoft 365 stack, on security as well, but not the whole stack, of course. And on top of that, I'm delivering user adoption, supporting customers in user adoption topics. And I work with Teams calling solutions and with Teams room systems. That's enough to keep one occupied. Let's check the agenda. First, we're going to talk about user access to Microsoft 365 apps and services. Of course, that's not going to be a technical deep dive into how this works. This just sets the base for everything that I'm going to talk about later, as well as the conditional access basics. It's going to be very quick. I'm just going to talk about what conditional access actually is on a fairly high level. We're going to have a look at how a policy is actually set up, and we're going to examine the example policy that I set up for a quick demo. It's not going to be a live demo. That's just something that I added to one of my slides. After that, we are going to talk about a common conditional access policy approach that I see lots of times with customers when they already started working with conditional access, and we are supposed to do a review of their policy set, or mostly just a single policy in that case. And after that, we're going to dive into the best practice policy set that I brought with me today. It seems like we're going to talk about the best practice policy sets in 10 minutes only, looking at the agenda and the bullet points, but it's going to be roughly half an hour for the introduction, for the basics, and then it's going to be probably more than half an hour talking about our best practice policy set. Concerning questions, of course, I'm happy to answer questions during the session, but I especially reserved some time for a Q&A session at the end of the topics that I'm going to talk about, and I'd be happy to discuss our best practices, to discuss scenarios that you might have that you want to tackle with conditional access, and get into sort of an exchange on everything that I was talking about before. So much about the agenda. Let's start. User access to Microsoft 365 apps and services, or to literally any app or service that requires an Azure AD authentication. I'm keeping this short. In most cases, it's username and password. User logs in, enters their UPN, enters the password, and then they get access to whatever they want to have access to, or to whatever they have a right on the application level. We are all technical professionals. I don't have to explain that this just doesn't suffice anymore. You can access everything from anywhere, from any device. We have no idea, because that's the best thing out of the box. There's going to be no alert if one of my users logs in from, I don't know, South America. We are based in Austria. Something seems very wrong when this authentication would have been successful. The question might arise that I don't know about MFA. Well, I do know about MFA, and let me just quickly define what I understand as MFA in the context of today's session. To me, MFA means using the Microsoft Authenticator, or using SMS to get a PIN, or God forbid, use a phone call to perform MFA, to pass MFA. I have a few problems with MFA. First of all, it's cumbersome for users. No one likes MFA, not from a user's perspective. I do like MFA from a security perspective sometimes, because it's still better than nothing. But that's one of my main problems that I have with it. Cumbersome for the user. No one likes that. You have a potentially high rollout effort. Rolling out MFA can be fun with 20 users. It's not fun anymore if you have 800 different users, because most of the times they need someone to aid them on on setting up the Microsoft Authenticator in example. At least that's the experience that we have here in Austria, and also with other companies throughout Europe. One of the main other problems that I have with MFA is that it's only an identity protection. What does that mean? I can roll out MFA. Everyone's doing MFA when they log in. But still, every single user in my company can use his personal devices to log in. They enter the UPN, they enter their password, they'll pass MFA, and then they use the family computer, which 4 people have access to. Everyone has local admin rights, and we have no idea what's going on that PC. Is someone gonna install ransomware? Is someone gonna save or download company data on the personal device? Lots and lots of red flags here. On top of that, and that's the worst thing, MFA just isn't enough anymore. Token theft is increasing. Just 2 days ago, in preparation for today's event, I read a Microsoft article exactly on that topic, pointing out that token theft is becoming a real issue. So it doesn't matter if you use SMS for MFA, or the Microsoft Authenticator, or you set up the Microsoft Authenticator to perform passwordless sign-in, doesn't make any difference. The session token can still be stolen and be used by an attacker. So we're not talking about MFA fatigue. Microsoft released functionalities that allow to be secure from MFA fatigue. We're talking about token theft here, which becomes a problem. Well, what's the better solution? Of course, conditional access with a best practice policy approach, of course. Everyone that already worked with conditional access knows that you could also only enforce MFA using conditional access. But again, that from our opinion, or from my opinion in general, just wouldn't be enough to be secure. Talking about the basics, I'm going to keep this really short and simple, or at least I'm trying to keep it as short as possible. What's the feature? Easy to explain. I can add certain criteria which needs to be met to give access. And let me point out something at this point. Conditional access doesn't work like a firewall. That's a common misinterpretation that people believe it's like with a firewall, everything's blocked, and I create policies to allow certain access. That's not the case with conditional access. If I do not configure anything in conditional access, it's still going to be username and password, which means if I create a new policy, I start restricting access. So it's a different logic than with a firewall. Conditional access, adding policies there means adding more restrictions for your users and for access. Let me just give a really quick example of conditional access from the user's perspective. Let's say the user tries to access Microsoft Teams from a personal device. What's it going to look like? They open the Microsoft Teams client. They're going to put in their UPN. Going to put in their password, and normally they'd get access straight away, or maybe you set up per user MFA, then they would get an MFA challenge, and then they'll have access to Microsoft Teams from their personal device. In this case, you're going to see what you're seeing right now. You can't get there from here. What we are requiring in this scenario is that the user needs to have, on top of knowing his password, a company-owned device, a company-managed device. So the user gets blocked because his company only allows access from company-managed devices. That would be just one example of how you could use conditional access. Another question that I get most of the times is, when does it actually set in? How does it work? Again, no technical deep dive, just to give you an idea. Conditional access sets in after the user entered his or her password. So it's not pre-authentication protection. It's gonna set in after the user successfully entered the correct password that they need. One thing that I want to note or point out right here is that it only works with Azure Active Directory. So let's say you deployed a custom application that uses on-prem Active Directory authentication. The user will get access to that application. Doesn't have any on-prem on-prem Active Directory authentication. Doesn't have anything to do with conditional access. We're only talking about Azure AD authentication right there. One thing that's always important in the Microsoft 365 world is, of course, the licensing. In this case, you're going to need an Azure Active Directory Premium P1. Every user that is affected by a policy needs the license assigned. It's a common question that I get every now and then. And what would be optional is Microsoft InTune. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the connection between conditional access and Microsoft InTune and when you would need that. InTune is optional in general, but it's not optional for our best practice policy set, as you will find out later in this session. Talking about the setup of a policy, we have to get into two parts. If we set up a policy, the first part would be assignments, and the second part would be configuring the access controls. Let me start off with the users. We assign a policy based on a user object. That would be one of the possibilities. So I could assign a policy specifically to one user, or I could assign a policy specifically to a group, or it could also be, and that's where it's getting important, an Azure Active Directory role. Why would I need that? It's a security reason, in my opinion. If I have a user and I assign a global admin role to the user, and I assign the user a conditional access policy on top. So let's say I have 5 users. Every one of these users has a global admin role, and I set up my policy. That's it. Of course, I'm not going to have 5 global admins in my environment. I'm just setting up an example to explain why we would need Azure AD role assigned conditional access policies. we get a new global administrator, we create the user, we assign the global admin role, that's it. What would happen is that the 6th user I'm talking about is not affected by the policy. We only assign the policies to the policy to the first 5 users, and the 6th user wouldn't be protected. If we assign the policy to an Azure Active Directory role, the global administrator, it doesn't matter which user gets the role because the policy is assigned to the role itself and affects every global administrator role or every InTune administrator role, whatever you set up that's in your environment that gets added into your environment. What's also possible would be workload identities. We're not going to talk about workload identities too much today. That's just an additional possibility that you have. Cloud apps or actions would be the next thing that we'd need to configure. Cloud apps or actions add to the user scope. What do I mean by that? Not selecting an app makes the policy useless. So let's say you create a policy, you assign the policy to all users in your environment. You're not selecting a cloud application and you're not selecting an action, which would be, just to give you an example, registering security information. Your conditional access policy is not going to do anything. In general, I always recommend to use all cloud applications. Depends on certain business cases that the customer might have, but by default, we should try to work with all cloud applications. Again, I'm going to explain our best practice policy set later on, and then you're going to see what I prefer, or where, not what I prefer, but where I need to make exclusions of the all cloud apps approach. Conditions work as an additional filter to create more granular policies. So let's say you have a policy, you assigned it to all the users, to all cloud apps, but you only want the policy to work if the certain user accesses Azure Active Directory, or specifically an application if they use a Windows device. Could also be network. That's an additional condition that can be used. Let's go on with the access controls. We have 2 possibilities. Possibility number 1 would be allowing access. Of course, if certain criteria is met. What kind of criteria that could be, we're going to talk about it later on. Could be, just to give you an idea, MFA, could be a hybrid Azure AD joint device, could be a club compliant device, and so on and so forth. Possibility number 2, we block the access. We will also talk about the rules that block access later on in the session. And the last part that we have to configure in a conditional access policy would be session controls. I'm just going to give you an idea. Sign-in frequency is one of the session controls. I could set up that users need to re-log in after 10 days or after 10 hours or after 20 days. It's up to you. And persistent browser session would be another example for a session control, meaning that I could configure that the user will be logged out after a certain number of hours if they're inactive in a browser session accessing any resource that requires Azure AD authentication. And of course, there's more on session controls. There's more on granting access and on conditions. But this session is not, as I said, about explaining everything that's technically possible. It's about best practices. So you might want to research other possibilities if you have never heard of them, never really worked with them. A few principles before we go on. What I already said is that conditional access doesn't work like a firewall, which means principle number 1 is if no policy is applied, access is always allowed. If I don't have a conditional access policy in place, or if I, as a user, am not affected by a conditional access policy, it's going to be username and password, and I will have access to the environment. The second principle that I want to point out is block always wins. So it could be that a user is not only affected by one policy, but by 3 different policies. If one of the policies results in a block, the user won't get access. Doesn't matter if he was granted access by the first 2 policies. If the 3rd policy blocks his access, he's not going to get access at all. That's linked to the 3rd principle. There is no best match or first match in conditional access. If a user is affected by multiple policies, the result has to be for every single policy grant access. Otherwise, you'll be blocked. You're not going to get access at all. Before we get into best practices, let me quickly guide you through the example policy. We've seen an example before, how conditional access works from a user's perspective. I just want to give you an idea, if you've never worked with conditional access, how we set up this policy. For the users, I went with a scope for all users and set an exception in the user scope, which is the Glassbreak admin. We are going to talk about Glassbreak admin best practices later in this session and how he adds to our best practice policy set. For the cloud steps and actions, we went with all cloud applications, no exceptions here. So in this case, wouldn't matter which cloud app the user is accessing, the user would need to have a compliant or hybrid Azure AD joint device, which is going to be the next thing that I'm going to show to you. For the conditions, we didn't set any additional conditions, wasn't necessary for the use case that we had. Granting access, we allow access if the device is compliant or if the device is hybrid Azure AD joined. The compliant state can only be used if you've licensed InTune. And that's where it gets interesting. What do I mean by if you've licensed InTune? There are 2 different scenarios. Scenario number 1, you're using a third-party MDM solution that's compatible with Microsoft InTune. What do I mean by that? Let's say you're using Mobile Iron to manage your iOS devices, to manage your Android devices. You could configure that Mobile Iron can hand over the compliant state of a device to InTune, and from there it can be used in conditional access. That would be possibility number 1. You need an InTune license to do that, and you need to have everything set up in Mobile Iron. Not every third-party solution is compatible with InTune. Jamf Pro would be another example that's compatible, but there are lists online where you can get the details on that. Possibility number 2 would be, of course, if you use InTune to manage, for example, your iOS, Android, and macOS devices. And if you set up a compliance policy and the device is compliant, you will have access to the Office 365 resources. I'm just going to stick to Office 365 resources or applications for the rest of the session. Of course, you already know, doesn't matter if it's an Office 365 application, could be another SaaS application that you're using, which is using Azure AD authentication. No session control set for this example. So what about the common conditional access policy approach? I'm sure everyone has heard of this. My network is my castle. Everyone has heard this sentence. This sentence exists longer, or the mindset exists longer than I exist in IT. What does it look like if you combine that with conditional access? You're going to see a conditional access policy for everyone that enforces multi-factor authentication if you're outside of the company network, and if you're inside the company network and access Microsoft Teams, it's not a problem at all. You can access Teams without performing MFA, which means you're trusting your network, and that's an old security mindset. I'm sure everyone is familiar with that. It's not so much about the old security mindset in my opinion. The problem is that it's also easy to set up. Where do I see configurations like that? Especially if customers start working with conditional access by themselves, easy to set up. They saw it somewhere online that it might be a good idea. Can be one policy, great. We have secured identities. Or other consulting companies were there before and set that up as well. If I'm honest, there are other possibilities, and the consulting companies set that up. They might never really work with conditional access or know how it works. Now, what's the problem there? I'm just gonna finish with this sentence for the slide. Trust everyone and watch the rogues burn down your castle. That's what you're gonna get if you choose the common conditional access policy approach that I just talked about. Before we get into best practices, a few things to keep in mind. We use this as a basis for discussion with our customers. You can use it as a basis for discussion with your customers as well, or internally. What does a basis mean? It means that in most use cases, this is probably going to work. This is going to be the recommended security level from us. This doesn't mean that it's going to work in any case, but it's going to work in a lot of cases. You cannot set up conditional access policies by yourself alone without knowing the environment, without knowing business cases that the customer might have. Use it as a basis for discussion, what you would do, explain what the impact is, and then find the perfect solution for the customer and set that up with him together. Of course, it could, because these questions sometimes come up, if I talk about the best practice policy set, it could be even more secure. As I said, basis for discussion could be the outcome that you and the customer together decide that it should be even more secure. But as I said, it's a basic security level, which we recommend. You shouldn't lower the security level, or that's what I would recommend you to do. The next thing is that you should always aim for a two-step approach. What are the two steps? Step number one is defining the policies, discussing the policies. We're not going to configure anything. We just take our time, go through everything with the customer, make changes where we are supposed to change something or where we have to change something. Very important, document it. I'm going to get into why you need a documentation of your conditional access policies. You can use anything. To be honest, just use Microsoft Excel to create a documentation. And what I recommend as well is to review that with an expert. Not because I'm telling anyone that they have no idea how conditional access works. It's just about the fear of gaps. I'm not afraid if something's going to be blocked. I can check. Should it be blocked? Should it not be blocked? If it shouldn't be blocked, I make changes to my conditional access policies, but I'm afraid of things that work that shouldn't work. That's the fear of gaps. And we at our company, for example, define the policies, we document them, and then we let at least another consultant review them. Of course, it should be a consultant that knows how conditional access works and that implements conditional access policies also. Step number two would be the technical part, setting up the policies. And what's really important is that you work with a specific group that is excluded in every single policy that you set up for your rollout. Why should you do that? I'm sure there are people in this session that have worked with conditional access already. Then you know that there's a review only option. So you can create the policy. You're not going to activate it. You're going to set it to review only. And then you can, for example, check the sign-in logs and find out what the result of a conditional access policy would be if it would be turned on. That's a hassle, and I don't really like doing that. And on top of that, this doesn't give you real life feedback. So we are always working with a rollout group, meaning conditional access is not going to work for anyone in the company after we set it up. But if we remove a single user from that exclusion group, conditional access is going to be applied to that user. And that's how we control our rollout. In case something unexpected happens, I just add the user again to the exclusion group. And normally it takes a few minutes and conditional access is not affecting the user anymore. And I can fix the problem that might be there. Why documentation? First and foremost, there is no actual useful overview of all policies that you get out of the box. At least I don't know about a useful overview that you get with 2 clicks, where you have an idea what you actually configured. So that's why we create that. If anyone knows a one-click solution to get a useful overview, I'm happy to listen to that. I know about scripts, but still before scripting everything, I'd much rather enter that into my documentation, review it, and configure everything afterwards. Easier to review means, of course, it's going to be easier to spot gaps that you might have, and that adds up to your security level. One more thing, we're all IT professionals, but anyways, I just want to tell everyone that's the key to our cloud environment, or to your cloud environment that we are talking about. So take your time, make sure there are no gaps, give it the importance that it should have. One more thing, no customer without conditional access. That's a best practice that I live with. I don't have any customers that have no conditional access. Doesn't matter if it's 20 people, doesn't matter if it's 800 people. If you have the arguments that are needed, they're going to go with conditional access, and they're not going to ask why they need an additional license for security reasons. Let's talk about the best practice policy set. If you've been waiting for it, now is the time. We set up a bunch of different policies by default. The first one's the glass break admin policy. Gonna get into detail what the glass break admin best practice is, and we're gonna get into detail with the policy setup as well. We have policies for internal admins, for external admins, for users, and that's what we try to do. Every user needs to have a trusted device and can work with a personal device. Of course, there are bring your own device scenarios, but as I said, as a basis for discussion, we normally talk to the customer. We ask if there are legit reasons why a user needs to have their personal device for work. Most of the cases, I'd say 90%, there are no reasons. They get the equipment they need from their company. InTune enrollment and compliance date, you might be wondering why there is a conditional access policy specifically for that. I'm going to explain that later, as well as guest access. They have their own policy, service accounts as well. Why they need a specific policy will be explained, of course. And then we have 3 different policies that just block access if certain criteria is met. The first one's the legacy authentication, which is actually almost legacy. I'm going to tell you later on in this session why I still add that to my best practice policy set, and why you should probably add that as well. Specific users and groups. You were expecting the first policy, but no. We need a specific user for our best practice policy and a bunch of groups. The specific user, you probably already guessed it, is the glass break admin. And we need a few groups. Group number 1 would be the external admins. Why do we need that? Let me just go back to the other slide, because we are going to create a policy for external admins, and this policy will be assigned to a group, the external admins group. That's the one we're going to create before we start configuring the policies. Same thing, same scenario with the service accounts, and of course with the InTune enrollment. And then there's the no conditional access group, which is the group that you're going to be using to roll out conditional access. Every member in our Azure Active Directory will be part of this group. So that's a cloud-only group. That's not something that I'd create on-prem, because you'll have environments where you have cloud-only users and you have hybrid identities, users that are synced from your on-prem Active Directory, and you could either create 2 groups, one for the on-prem users, one for the cloud users, and in this case, it's, from my point of view, fine to create a cloud security group and add every member in your Azure Active Directory to this group. And by member, I mean every user that has the user type member and not the user type guest. I already talked about the next bullet points you can see there, used as a part of our rollout. And as I said, if there's a user impact, you can just add the user to the no conditional access group again, fix whatever needs to be fixed. The user can go on with his access and his work. And after you fixed it, you can remove them from the no conditional access group again. Let's get into the policies. Policy number 1 would be the glass break admin. Why do I even need that? In the next policy, the internal admin policy, we will configure certain requirements that need to be met if an administrator wants to access Office 365. Doesn't matter what it is. If there's anything that blocks administrators from accessing, MFA doesn't work. They have problems with the hybrid Azure ID joint device. We're talking about a worst case scenario, which I never lived through with my customers. We're talking about an absolute emergency. We need a glassbreak admin that only needs a username and only needs a password to avoid being locked out of our own tenant. That's the main reason why we need the glassbreak admin. It's going to be, of course, the vulnerablest account in our environment. It should have a complex password, and please don't store the password in the keypass that everyone in your department is using. Why not? Because we want to protect ourselves from rogue admins. As I said, it's a highly vulnerable account. It could also be used by a rogue admin who works for our company. If you feel like I'm completely crazy now, I have customers, actually 2 of them, that had the issue. I told them, don't save it in your KeyPass, save it, and that's the better approach. Print it out, don't save it anywhere digitally, and put it in a fireproof safe. What would be even better is to separate the password into 2 parts, store one part in the CEO safe and store the other part in a safe in a bank. That would be the best practice approach. That would be what I would do if I was responsible for this password. What do you want to avoid? I guess most of you do that, but I see that so many times. Don't name your glassbreak admin at company.com or emergency admin at company.com or some superhero name at company.com. Anyone who will have access to your Azure Active Directory will search for names like that and immediately knows this is a vulnerable account. I want to have access to that user. And if they know about conditional access and anything there is out there around securing identities in Microsoft 365, they probably already know that they only have to find out the password to get access. What would be a better solution? There are many approaches there. So let's say my email address for my normal user is philipp.ebner@acp.at. I'd go with ebner.philipp@acp.it. So I'm just switching last name and first name, and the email address where the last name comes first, that's going to be the UPN for my admin account. You can already see it on the bottom right. The guy's getting completely ecstatic if you set up a sign-in alert on top of that. As I said, the most vulnerable account in our environment, we can set up sign-in alerts, for example, using Azure services. And what I would go for is an email alert if the glassbreak admin signs in, and an SMS as well, just in case. Of course, you need to manage the password. You should test and change the password regularly. Testing is as important as changing the password. And I advise my customers to do that at least quarterly. I mean, in an ideal world, you're going to do this every month. But I'm happy if people actually do that every 3 months at least. And I didn't really talk about what kind of user and what admin role the glassbreak admin is going to have, but you can already guess it by now, I guess. It's going to be a cloud-only user that you create directly in Azure Active Directory, and he's going to have a global admin role, of course. It's for emergencies. You might be wondering why we need a conditional access policy for the Glassbreak admin at all. At the beginning of the session, I said if there is no conditional access policy in place that affects a user, the user can log in with UPN and password. That would be the case for the Glassbreak admin. But we create a policy for one single reason, the sign-in session, or the session, the sign-in session. What's the policy going to look like? The user scope is going to be the Glassbreak admin, of course. For clouds, apps, or actions, we're going to go with all cloud apps. Doesn't matter what the Glassbreak admin wants to access. He will be signed out after 2 hours. That's our best practice policy approach there. So let's say someone signs in with the Glassbreak admin. After 2 hours, they're going to be automatically signed out. And very important, no MFA. This is solely for an emergency. If nothing else works, if you don't have access to your tenant, you need access, you want the username, you want the password, you don't want to be rely on MFA in an emergency case. Could be that an administrator set up MFA for the Glassbreak admin 2 months ago. He left the company and no one reset MFA for this account. You're not going to get access with this account as well. Why am I pointing that out? Because just recently I was talking to a customer. They already work the Microsoft partner in Austria, and we had the problem that their Glassbreak admin had to pass MFA as well. So as I said, the only reason is emergency. Otherwise, you wouldn't need a Glassbreak admin. What about the internal admins? Every user that has an admin role assigned, and it doesn't matter if it's the user admin role, the security admin role, the global admin role, and on top of that, we even add the security reader and the global reader to this policy. They need to have a hybrid Azure AD joint device, and they need to perform MFA every single day, every 10 hours. That's how we configure that. What's recommended is that you don't use the Microsoft Authenticator or you're using SMS to pass the MFA challenge. What's recommended is to use a phishing resistant MFA method, which would be a FIDO2 key. Why are we recommending that? Because I think roughly around a month ago, Microsoft added a preview feature to conditional access, which allows us to specifically require an authentication strength that we set. In this case, phishing resistant MFA. So as I said, I'd work with a FIDO2 key in the case of an internal admin. Just really quick, what does the policy look like? We have a user scope, which is every single admin role and the global reader and the security reader, and we're going to exclude. Why are we excluding any users in this policy? Remember, the Glassbreak admin has a global admin role. If we wouldn't exclude the Glassbreak admin in this case, that would mean that the Glassbreak admin would be affected by the internal admin's policy and require a hybrid Azure AD joint device and MFA. That would be a problem. So we are going to exclude the Glassbreak admin, the user. We are going to exclude external admins because external admins from our definition are admins that are users from a, I'm going to get into that in a minute. Someone turned on their microphone. Okay, turned off. And we're going to exclude the service accounts as well. Just as a rule of thumb, every exclusion that you might set needs to have another dedicated policy. That's the rule of thumb. There will be a dedicated policy for external admins. There will be a dedicated policy for service accounts. Otherwise, service accounts and external admins, everyone who's part of either of the groups would only need a username and a password. And we exclude another role. We exclude the directory sync account role. You might be familiar with this role. If you're not, that's the role that the Azure AD Connect user has assigned by default, and we're excluding this role in every policy because we don't want an impact on this account, because that would lead to problems with our Azure AD Connect synchronization. Cloud apps or actions, of course, all cloud apps, doesn't matter what the internal admins want to get access to, they have to have a hybrid Azure AD joint device and a phishing resistant MFA method. For the session, we're going to set a sign-in frequency of 10 hours. As I said, they have to relog in every single day. That's how we do that. And you might be wondering where the device status is in this configuration. We're going to use one of the following policies, which will also affect the users that have an admin role, because one of the following policies will affect every member in our Azure Active Directory, and that means, of course, also every user that has a global an admin role in general assigned. For the external admins, I started talking about that on the slide before. That's mainly used for consultants or other service providers that need admin access to your environment but do not have a compliant device. That's a common scenario. Let's say we are working in the Microsoft 365 environment of a customer. We need to have administrative access. They're not going to provide us one of their devices. They're not going to provide us access to their network and use the network as added security for an external admin. They're just going to create this policy probably. And we set up this policy, as I said, with the external admins group, which will allow us to control who's authorized to get admin access without having a compliant device. If we wouldn't have this external admins policy in place and we create a cloud-only user for a consultant or for another service provider and assign that user a global admin role or any admin role, they would be affected by the internal admins policy, which means they would be required to have phishing resistant MFA and on top of that a hybrid Azure AD joint device. And of course, these requirements cannot be met by an external admin. What's important for me is, you can already read it on the slide, only create this if it's necessary. I have certain customers in the banking sector, for example, they don't even allow external user accounts in general. That's their rule. If they don't allow it in general, don't create the policy. Would only be a security risk if the group exists. Why would it be a security risk if there is no need for an external admin? We're going to answer that question after we saw how the policy is set up. The user scope is quite straightforward. The group's going to be external admins. They're going to be affected by this policy. We are going to exclude, once again, the Glassbreak admin. And you might wonder why we do that. Because from a technical perspective, it doesn't make any sense at all. The Glassbreak admin is not part of the external admins group, and therefore he will not be affected by this policy. We're just doing this for the rare case that the Glassbreak admin somehow is added to the external admins group. That's our emergency account. We don't want some coincidence to be a problem. And we, of course, are going to exclude the service accounts because they have their own policy. And just to keep everything clean, as I said, from a technical perspective, it wouldn't be necessary. But from a reviewer's perspective, it just adds to the overview. That's my opinion here. And again, we're excluding the directory sync account role, just in case someone adds this account to the external admins group. We're going to go with all cloud apps, doesn't matter what the external admin wants to access, and we're going to require MFA. And that, in most cases, is the only added security we can have with an external admin user. As I said, most companies, they don't give a service provider a company device or access to their network. And to be honest, I don't think it is a good idea to add someone to your network or to give them access to your network just for security reasons. Doesn't make any sense. If they don't need access to a network resource, don't add them, and we're going to stick to MFA. For the session, same thing as with other admins, they need to log in every single day. if they sign in every single day. User trusted device, that's the policy that is going to affect every single member in our Azure Active Directory. And every single member in our Azure Active Directory, again, I'm talking about the user type here, needs to have a compliant device or a hybrid Azure AD joint device to get access. For us, using a company managed device is enough as a second factor. It counts as a second factor, and it fulfills two requirements that we have from a security perspective. Requirement number one, it protects the identity. No one can log in as long as they don't have a compliant or hybrid Azure AD joint device from our company. And the second requirement that we have from a security perspective would be allowing access only from managed devices, from company devices. And we fulfill both requirements, as I said, with this policy. In a default scenario, we normally do not add another factor like Azure MFA or a FIDO2 key. It's about the perfect balance between security and usability. Could be more strict. We could add an additional factor, but if you do so, please don't add Azure MFA every 5 days, because that doesn't make any sense at all from a security perspective. Let's say you have account managers that are on the road a lot and their company laptop gets stolen, the user knows the password to the company laptop, then you've already lost, because the additional Azure MFA is not going to help you at all, because it's going to be requested after 7 days. Unless it's 1 day before it's requested again, then you might win, or if it's the same day, but there's no added security here. It's more about making everything cumbersome for the user, because they have MFA Monday each week without adding any security there. Of course, you could add MFA, but then I'd add it for every single day. Then it makes more sense. Someone steals the laptop, and yeah, they are going to have access for the rest of the day, but they are not going to have access on the following day, because they will be challenged with MFA, and then they need the second factor, a FIDO2 key, whatever you set up, or the phone of the person that they stole the laptop from. We're going to exclude Microsoft Intune, the application. Why? You can already read it. I'm not going to read it to you, just talking about it really quick. If we do not exclude Microsoft Intune here, we are going to block the Intune enrollment with this policy, and we would block reobtaining the compliant state in case a user lost it because they were inactive for a long time or for another reason. And that adds to the internal admins policy. As I showed you on one of the other slides, I said, well, we only configured phishing resistant MFA for the internal admins. Every internal admin is going to be affected by this policy as well, because they're a member in our Azure Active Directory, and that means two policies apply for the internal admins: phishing resistant MFA. This policy, which requires a hybrid Azure AD joint device or a compliant device, and you already know there is no first match. Every policy that affects a user needs to grant access. So in case the internal admin has passed the phishing resistant MFA request, they're not going to get access if they do not also have a hybrid Azure AD joint device or compliant device, because this policy affects them and requires that. User trusted device. What's the scope? All users. And we already know that. We're going to exclude the Glassbreak admin. We're excluding the external admins because they don't have compliant or hybrid Azure AD joint devices. And we exclude the service accounts as well. I'm going to get into detail why we always do that when we talk about the service accounts policy. What I highlighted here is guests and external users. All users is one of the default groups that you can choose from if you set up a conditional access policy. There's no need to create that by yourself. It's the same thing with guest and external users. It's one of the default groups, which includes all user type guest objects in our Azure Active Directory. Why is that important? Because all users, the default group in conditional access includes every single user type there is, even guests. Both user types, members, and guests, and that's why we need to exclude them here, because a guest user in our environment is not going to have a compliant or hybrid Azure AD joint device in our environment. What about the cloud apps or actions? We're going to require a hybrid Azure AD joint device or a compliant device for every single cloud application access except Intune. As I just said, otherwise it wouldn't be possible to enroll devices in Microsoft Intune. That's why we need this exclusion. What are we going to configure for the grant part? We're going to configure that you have to have a compliant device or a hybrid Azure AD joint device. Make sure not to click on both. Otherwise, they need to have a hybrid Azure AD joint device and a compliant device to access company resources, and that might be a problem for all phones in example, because you can't hybrid Azure AD join them, of course. InTune enrollment and compliance state. That's the policy that might seem odd to anyone who worked with conditional access already. When we had a look at the overview, this allows the user to access Microsoft Intune if one of the following criteria is met. Let's say you're inside the company network, then you're free to use the Microsoft Intune app to perform an Intune enrollment or to reacquire your compliance state. Same thing if you are compliant in Intune in general, because the Microsoft Intune application is used every now and then by the company portal app, if I remember that correctly. And if our device is compliant, we want the application to be accessed in case it needs to be accessed. And the third possibility would be that you're part of the InTune enrollment group. Why do we need that? Let's say you have a new Android phone and you want to enroll in InTune. Well, the device is not compliant in Intune yet. You're just starting to enroll it, so that's not going to work. You don't have a Wi-Fi profile on your phone, so the company network's not going to work either. What are we going to do? We're going to add the specific user to the Intune enrollment group. As soon as the user has been added to the group, the user will be able, a few minutes later, to enroll the device in Microsoft Intune. After the enrollment was successful, the device is going to be compliant in Intune, and we remove the user from our Intune enrollment group. In case the device is not compliant anymore, the user has to have access to the company network or needs to be added to the Intune enrollment group again. That would be the case. Let's say you have a CEO and he's on a business trip. He's not getting access to the company network for the next few days. His device is not compliant anymore. You'd add him to the Intune enrollment group and he'd be able to reobtain the compliance state. Why no MFA, you might ask? We could secure the access to the Intune application with MFA. That is a possibility, but there are two problems. Problem number one, not every device supports MFA during Intune enrollment. There are certain Android devices that don't support that. So you'd need an additional device to perform MFA to enroll the device, which is just a hassle. And the second problem here is MFA means token theft. And token theft means the possibility to enroll the device if we require MFA for a Intune enrollment. What does the policy look like? Userscope, same thing as always. All users are going to be affected. We exclude the same users as always, except the Intune enrollment group. We exclude the Intune enrollment group, as I just said before. And for the clouds, apps, or actions, we're going to scope this policy to Microsoft Intune only. We have an exclusion in the policy where you need a compliant or hybrid Azure AD joint device. And for this exclusion, specifically, we create this policy so that there's no gap. For the conditions, we don't require anything. The user can or could access up till now from anywhere with a username and a password. But if we have a look at what we require for granting access, the location doesn't really play a role anymore. So let's say the user is somewhere out and about, and they are trying to access the Microsoft InTune app. They need a compliant or hybrid Azure AD joint device unless they're in the company network. That's what I just explained before, and that's the configuration that allows us what we've just seen. Digression time, exclusion of conditions. There's a common misinterpretation that I get to hear every now and then, and this common misinterpretation is that exclusions of conditions are connected with end statements. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. So let's say we have a user that's affected by a policy that requires a hybrid Azure AD joint device. We configure two conditions. Condition number one would be this policy applies except if you are in the company network, and the policy doesn't apply if you are accessing Office 365 apps via a browser, just to give you an idea. What customers tend to think, or other consultant colleagues as well, is that the user that doesn't have a hybrid Azure AD joint device needs to be in our company network and can only access Office 365 apps via a browser if he's already inside our company network. Well, that's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because the user is affected by either exception. This means he'll also get access if he only uses his personal device somewhere at home in his personal network, in his network at home. He's using the browser, he opens Microsoft Teams, he's going to be allowed to do that because exclusions of conditions are connected with OR statements. That's one thing that I just wanted to point out during the session. Let's get back into our best practice policies. We have a policy for guest access. You might remember we created a policy that affects every user except guest users. This policy is going to affect every single guest object in our Azure Active Directory. And what we normally require is MFA every 10 hours. And on top of that, they have to consent to our company's terms of use the first time they log in. And then after, I think our default is 180 days. But to be honest, the terms of use are not really an IT topic, might be more a topic for the law department. The policy setup is fairly easy and quick. We're going to use the default group, all guests or external users, as a scope for this policy. We're going to exclude what we always exclude. Already talked about that, nothing new here. And we are going to add all cloud apps or actions. Doesn't matter what the guest is accessing, they always need to pass MFA and they need to accept our terms of use at least once, and then after a certain number of days, once again. For the session, we're going to go with a sign-in frequency of 10 hours. One more thing on terms of use. Terms of use can be set up in the Conditional Access portal. And after you set them up, after you edit them, basically, they will appear as a possible selection in the grant section. Service accounts, overview. Why do we even need that? I said that I'm going to tell you that because in most of the cases, service accounts, first and foremost, cannot perform MFA. It's one of the reasons. The second reason, you might already guess that as well, they cannot authenticate from a company device because they are not authenticating from a company device. That could be a service account that you're using for your mail for your newsletter software as a service, this account is going to authenticate from the network of the manufacturer of the newsletter application, and they're not going to authenticate from a device in your company, which means by default, we are using the company network and or the manufacturer's network as added security. I was talking about the common conditional access policy approach, but company network or literally any network is still better than no protection at all. Of course, service accounts policies can be customized based on the environment. Let's say you have a service account on a Microsoft Teams room system. You could set that up that the Microsoft Teams room system is a compliant device and use the compliant state of that device for your conditional access service accounts policy. That would be a customization of the service account or a different approach on service accounts. There is even one more approach that's even more secure, but also means more administrative effort, depends, which is that you set up service account policies based on applications, and you only allow certain service accounts access to the applications that they need. So let's say you have your newsletter application and they only need access to the newsletter application, could be, and they need access to Exchange Online, then you'd add actually a policy set in this scenario, which would allow access to Exchange and to the newsletter application, but would block access to literally any other cloud application that you have available in your environment. Back to the very basic service accounts policy, the user scope is going to be the service account group that we created before starting with the setup, and we're going to exclude what we always exclude. It's going to be all cloud applications in this scenario. As I said, that can be customized depending on the security requirements that the customer has. This is the block policy. I'm just going to show you everything. We can see we're going to block access. What does it mean? If you are part of the service accounts group, you're excluded in any other conditional access policy, but you're going to be affected by this one. And this one's going to block your access from any location that you try to authenticate from, except the company network and the trusted manufacturer's network. You can set that up, of course, in the conditional access portal as well. I think it's under the named locations, under the named locations button. So that's the reason why we work with a block policy here. Every access is blocked except you're using the network. Let's talk about the block legacy authentication, where I said this is almost legacy. Why so? Microsoft began to block legacy authentication in tenants on starting from October 1st this year, but the process hasn't ended yet. So what I recommend is that you still create the block legacy authentication policy as long as this process hasn't finished. I do so, and on top of that, we need this, generally speaking, because legacy protocols allow to bypass MFA. I mean, looking at the policies that we created up till now, MFA doesn't really play an important part in our policy set. So you could say, well, external admin service accounts, they can use legacy protocols and bypass MFA. Doesn't matter because they're not using MFA at all. I'd still set that up. And if you set that up, it's very important that you check the sign-in logs before you enable this policy, because it might be that users are still using legacy authentication protocols to access Exchange Online using their mobile phones, and you have to get rid of that issue before you enable this. Otherwise, they would be blocked. Well, it depends on the device you're using and the application you're using, what happens, but I'd assume a block and handle it like that. how's the policy set up? It's going to be scoped to all users, and we're only going to accept the Glassbreak admin, no other accounts, not the external admins. They're probably not going to use any legacy protocols at all. You might want to think about the service accounts, because a lot of service accounts use authenticated SMTP, and authenticated SMTP is a legacy protocol which would be affected by this policy if you turn it on and you don't create an exception for the particular service accounts that use authenticated SMTP. It's going to work for all cloud applications, and for the conditions, we're going to work with the client applications, and we're going to choose two of them. We're going to choose the Exchange Active Sync client and other clients. Other clients meaning this includes, for example, IMAP, POP3, authenticated SMTP, and so on. And we're not going to grant access, we're going to block access, meaning you're a user, you're affected, you're using Exchange Active Sync, you're going to be blocked. That's the whole policy explained there. Block other countries. Block other countries is additional security, nothing more, nothing less. With this policy, we're going to block access from countries that our users normally don't authenticate from, which we're going to set up in the named locations. So that's what I assume that you're going to do before setting up the policy. And this needs to be monitored. Very important. You already have two examples there. CEO travels to Japan. You block Japan because no one in your company, you would assume, would ever travel to Japan. He has this one business meeting there. He's going to be blocked. Inform the first level support, because if it's the CEO, and it's always the CEO, it's not some random junior consultant that you have in your company that might be okay with a little delay. It's going to be the CEO if this happens. So that's what I would recommend, to monitor this and to inform first level support what they need to do in case of a block. The policy by default is scoped to all users except the Glassbreak admin and the directory sync accounts. And for the cloud applications, we're going to go with all cloud applications. We're going to go with any location. I'm just going to show you everything. We're going to block access if you access from any location except from the trusted countries that you defined in the named location in the conditional access portal. The last policy is some kind of add-on. Why? Blocking users and sign-ins at high risk is an Azure Active Directory Premium P2 feature. So in case your customer has that, or in case our customers have that, we normally tend to set up this policy, which will result in every user that is marked as high risk, or any sign-in that's marked at as high risk, they're going to be blocked. Azure Active Directory Premium P2 required. Just going to go through this really quick because most of the things you've already seen a bunch of times. It's a block policy again, and the conditions are user risk high, sign-in risk high. In case that happens, conditional access is going to block the access, and we have to remediate the problem. Well, we have 15 minutes left before we get into the Q&A session. I want to talk about the conditional access community that's alive on LinkedIn. It's, as far as I know, the biggest conditional access community on LinkedIn, and it's quite young. One of my colleagues created this community about a month ago, increasing user numbers, and I invite everyone to join this community. We try to create a space where we inform each other about new changes to conditional access, where we inform each other about tools that allow gap analyzing, for example. Just today, one of my colleagues shared a tool that allows that. Haven't looked into it yet. Might be very, not might be, but will be very, very interesting. The QR code is gonna, of course, redirect you to the group immediately. Otherwise, you can click the link after you downloaded the PowerPoint presentation. Well, that's it from my side. I'm ready for Q&A. Of course, happy to connect after this session as well to discuss best practices. Maybe after you reviewed the slides, just add me on LinkedIn. I added the link to my profile on one of the first slides, or you just search for me on LinkedIn and add me. I'd be happy to connect and exchange and discuss best practices, different scenarios, other approaches to conditional access in general. Let me just check if there's any messages in the Teams chat. There's a lot of messages in the Teams chat.
There are a couple for sure.
Okay. Doug, do you have an overview on everything?
Yeah, let me scroll back up a little ways. I start really early on, and I don't know if you had caught this one or not, but sorry, excuse me.
Or
All right, sorry
just
about that. Had to grab
read
water.
really quick.
Yeah, Pascal had a question about conditional access only kicks in post authentication. How would you prevent brute force login attempts?
I think someone already answered that.
Yeah, it was just with the link. If there were anything else
They-
outside of the links.
That would be the content that I would have posted as well. In this case, maybe we have a look at the second one. Eric said one of the things we do in a lot of our policies is require hybrid Azure AD joint device. When the traffic comes to Chrome, we need to have the extension. That's correct. This works 99% of the time, but in 1%, not passing correct information. I've yet to figure out what needs to be done to fix that. Eric, I have no idea, to be honest, because that's something. Of course, when we talk about conditional access, we talk about the browser restrictions you can't use in private tabs. You need the extension in Chrome. You need to set a specific setting in Firefox, or you just to use Microsoft Edge and it works out of the box. I've never experienced that. We can get in touch on LinkedIn on that, because if you have been challenged with that, it might be that I'm going to be challenged with that as well in the foreseeable future. And I'd love to have an answer to that as well. But right now, I have no idea where it doesn't work in 1% of the cases.
Yeah, I did also post a reply for Eric's question on it, but it's pretty much kind of a wide guess at it.
Then it says, make sure you don't lock yourself out. Well, that's true. I didn't say that. Conditional access also works to lock yourself out completely. I never had the case, but I heard that it's not really a situation that you want to be in, especially as a consultant, because that's not just one phone call with Microsoft. That requires, as far as I know, a longer support process to regain access to the tenant. You have to prove that you have the ownership on the tenant and so on and so forth. Not something that I want to do. So Pascal, you're right. Make sure not to log yourself out. Then it's about the PRT.
And then Ryan had a question as well about understanding or the terminology around determining gaps coverage.
Yeah, give me a second. My apologies. Okay, I try to understand what you actually mean. Maybe we start with the firewall conditional access thing. Yes, that's correct. Searching a gap would mean, if I understand that correctly. Otherwise, Ryan, you can unmute yourself and we can just discuss that. Finding gaps means that the user is not affected by a restriction that we want to have in place. I don't know if we're going in the correct direction in this in concerning this question, and I don't know if Ryan answered. Sorry, I had to jump off for a second. Ryan, are you there? I mean, we can discuss it, but because I don't quite get it.
Sorry, and I've been getting pulled aside here frequently, but I apologize. I missed the beginning of your session. So I just find one of the things confusing about setting up conditional access policy is just making sure that you've actually covered all your gaps, and it doesn't start with the premise that there is no access, because they might have access to some of these. It's not like a firewall where everything is denial from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
So when you start applying these policies, then it gets a little bit confusing. Like, well, are we starting with no access and then blocking it, or do they have access? Yes. You know what I mean?
You start with everyone has access to everything using, let's say, username and password. I mean, I know about security defaults and so on and so forth, or per user MFA, but let's just start. You have username and password. Everyone can have access to everything, and you add restrictions to that. And the goal would be that there is no gap where a user can have access without without fulfilling certain requirements, which would be hybrid Azure AD joint device as a requirement, which could be for the service accounts that you need to be inside the company network. Does that help you at all? Or are we still talking about two different things here?
I think so. It's just that it gets confusing when you start to layer multiple conditional access policies. That
it is. That's the challenge.
Access, and then you're blocking access. Like, well, if everybody already has access, then it's intuitively you would think you would start with, well, then we start needing to block access. Why would you need to grant access create a grant access rule if they already have access?
Just the grant access rule. Maybe I didn't I didn't say that correctly or detailed enough. Grant access is always connected to some certain requirement. You can't just create a policy and say grant access and just don't check any of these boxes. The only thing you could do is to not configure block or grant at all and just choose a session control. We do that when we are working with the Glassbreak admin, because we don't want to block the Glassbreak admin. We don't want to create an additional requirement like MFA or a hybrid Azure AD joint device. We only want him to relog in after 2 hours, but that's an exception. Normally, you'd always go with grant access and then choose from a list of requirements, and that ultimately adds to a block if they're not fulfilling the requirement. But what you mean, I guess, also is that the logic behind conditional access is very confusing. And I can just add to that. It seems very easy. If you just set up one policy, you block, you enforce MFA for everyone who's outside your network, and if you're inside the network, you can just have access by typing in your username and password. That's why so many companies set that up, or even consulting companies set that up, because you don't need any knowledge about conditional access at all, in my opinion, to configure something like that. I mean, Ryan, I don't know if that helps. It seems like, did you already work with conditional access, or is this kind of, are you just getting into it right now?
No, we have a lot of conditional access policies set up, but it's just it's the verbal math kind of thing that when you're trying to make sure that you have everything covered, it gets a little bit confusing. But this session has been helpful because you start from like a higher level viewpoint and then scope it down from there, I think, and that's not where we started from. So,
Ryan, do you have a documentation of your policies where you can see all the settings in one overview?
Within conditional access itself, yes, but not like.
So you're clicking on the policy and then you're checking what you configured, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so the first thing that I would do is I can send you a template. I mean, it's just an Excel sheet, but it helps with creating the sheet. At least you save 1 hour or 2 hours, and you don't have to set that up. And then you could try to put in what you have actually configured, and then have a look at that. That would be one of the approaches that I take, and check. Okay, let's say a user logs in. What are they affected by? And what are our exclusions? And do we have a certain policy for every exclusion that we might set? That would be the approach that I take here.
Yeah, thank you. That would be helpful. We do use like the the reporting and the report only mode and the what do you call it? I forget the name of it, but it's sort of like the resultant policy. Like, is it you can put in a user, you can put in conditions and stuff and see what it looks like, but it's fine. Like you kind of need the inverse, or it feels like you need the inverse of that to be able to say, who does it not apply to? What am I missing? I guess it's maybe born out of paranoia. So.
What if is one of the tools that you can use, that I use for troubleshooting. So let's say someone's blocked. I have no idea why. I start with what if, check if they're affected by the policies that they should be affected from. And if that's the case, and there are no policies that apply to them that they shouldn't have applied, and that's why they get blocked, then I check sign-in logs and see what the problem is there. But as I said, maybe I didn't share my email address, but just add me on LinkedIn, maybe. I hope you have LinkedIn, and then I can send you the documentation sheet.
Philip, I don't know if you'll be able to add that into your PowerPoint slide that you share out with our user group. If you can, I can attach it to the files available. Course. Yeah, that might be easier for the attendees.
Just give me a second.
No worry. You can do that after this.
I'm just writing it down because I'm known for saying, yeah, we're going to do that. And then you never hear from me again because I forgot.
And then for everybody else, again, there's only a few minutes left. We do have our keynote coming up here, which is in a different session on the website. That is our noon keynote for collaboration and track information with Microsoft Lists and Teams, presented by Mark Cashman. And definitely, I know there's a few more questions.
Yeah, there are a few more questions, and we have 2 minutes left. I mean, for all I'm gonna try to answer one more or two more maybe, but as I said, just add me on LinkedIn, and I'm gonna answer your questions there.
Yeah. I do have to do one other thing that I forgot to say a few minutes ago. Okay. We do have a winner picked for this session as well. Eric Kruger, if you're still on here, you were selected on the randomized wheel of fortune. So congratulations.
So let's see, it's about authentication methods you can enable. Doug, you're a really helpful moderator, someone who knows the content of the session. That's perfect.
I am an MVP in this area.
So, well then, I
enjoy it. It was an awesome session.
Okay, well, great. Otherwise, you'd have to send me a message on LinkedIn and tell me what your opinion is. I'd be interested in any case for feedback, of course. For Glassbreak account, you could set up your conditional access policy to only allow.
I was hesitant on that one more because if CA goes down and does a failed close, you're truly locked out, and that's where you want just a complex passphrase with alerts set up, I figured.
Yeah, that's where I would go. Just having password access scares me too, but there is no other way to do this. Any other additional requirement that you might set for your Glassbreak admin destroys the purpose of the Glassbreak admin.
And I think
then you wouldn't have to set up a Glassbreak admin at all.
Yeah, I think the other question I saw, I didn't have a direct answer on, was the IPv6 addresses from Eric. That was just after my response on the passphrase.
Let me check.
Anything you can do from a country perspective when the client machine is reporting an IPv6?
As far as I'm concerned, that's still an issue. We already talked about that, and we don't know a solution so far. That is an issue.
I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.
As far as I know, this isn't supported yet. But I'm gonna. That's a research question.